So Russia's parliament is due to vote to confirm a new prime minister after the country's whole government unexpectedly resigned last night. The new head of government is a surprise choice who had been running Russia's tax service. The government's resignation came hours after President Vladimir Putin announced proposals to change the constitution, which might allow him to stay in control at the end of his current term. Lucy Taylor is live for us in Moscow. Lucy, lots to get through, but let's just start off with regards to the choice of Prime Minister. What do we know about him?
Yes, so we do now know who this Prime Minister will be. It was announced last night. He's Mikhail Mishustin. He's the head of the Federal Tax Service. He's the man behind key reforms to that tax service, which have brought in a lot of new technology and are credited with doubling its tax revenues. So a very significant figure here, but not somebody that many people would have expected to be the choice for Prime Minister, not somebody that many people predicted. But of course, everything's been a big surprise over the last 24 hours. And he's very much a technocrat. He's worked his whole life, his whole career in the tax service, and not somebody who is likely to harbour his own personal political ambitions, and perhaps that might make him more likely to fall in line with the plans of President Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, the entire government stepping down came to a shock to many. Dmitry Medvedev saying the government is resigning to give Putin some room, I guess, to make these changes to the constitution. What do we know about the changes? What sort of changes is there likely to be made?
Well, this time yesterday, we didn't know anything about any constitutional changes. It all came as quite a surprise. The President, Vladimir Putin, gave his State of the Nation address. And at the end of that, after an hour of speaking about domestic policy issues, he announced that he wanted to make these changes to the constitution. They're quite sweeping changes. In a nutshell, it's transferring some of the powers that are currently held by the president towards the parliament and other political bodies. There's a state council as well. There are some other things as well, also restricting presidential term limits so that any successor to President Putin wouldn't be able to do the same number of terms that he himself has done. But there's a lot of speculation that all of this is designed to pave the way towards President Putin retaining control of Russian politics, but in a different role with expanded powers. So perhaps moving into the role of Prime Minister again, for example. That's not confirmed yet. That's very far off, perhaps. But we do know that President Putin will need to stand down at the end of his current term. These changes are now being worked on. It could take a while for that to be worked out. And the president said that he wants to see Russians vote on these changes. He wants a national referendum. We don't know yet when that would be, but it seems like everything's moving very quickly, and they might try to do that as soon as possible.
I want to explore that for a bit. What are analysts saying, Lucy? Because President Putin's term ends, I understand, in 2024, correct?
Yeah.
So what happens thereafter? So the constitutional changes, as reported, was taking power from the presidency and putting it to parliament, if I'm not mistaken. So what sort of bearing will this have on President Putin?
Well, yeah, you're right. Under the current constitution, he's allowed to do a maximum of 2 consecutive terms, and this is his second consecutive term. So he would need to stand down in 2024. He has been in this position before, though. He's previously done 2 consecutive terms, and what he did there was step back into the role of Prime Minister with Medvedev, the outgoing Prime Minister now, in the role of President, and, you know, effectively retaining a lot of the control in his role as Prime Minister. It doesn't seem like he's going to try to do that again. It seems like he is coming to the end of his presidency, but perhaps moving into the role of Prime Minister, into a different role with the State Council, for example, and taking more powers than he had last time. So not working in line with the presidency in the way that he did last time, but taking on some of that power for himself in a new expanded role. To be honest, at the moment, that is speculation. Nobody knows if that is Vladimir Putin's own personal plan. There's a long way to go. It's another 4 years before he needs to do any of that. But this seems to be falling in line for that kind of change.
What happens, Lucy, to all these Russian ministers? How many will be able to come back? I'm talking about foreign relations in particular as well. Sergei Lavrov is pretty much the face of Russia for the international community. Do you think he'll be back?
Well, President Putin has asked all the ministers, all the outgoing ministers, to stay on in their current roles until a new government is appointed. It does seem likely that a lot of those cabinet ministers will be the same faces brought back. Sergei Lavrov at the moment is on a foreign tour. He's been in India, he's now in Uzbekistan, officially as acting foreign minister, but he hasn't curtailed that trip. I don't know if that might be a sign that he's planning to stay on in that role. As you say, he is a figurehead for the country, and he probably had the chance to stand down during the presidential election that we've just had, and he didn't do that. So who knows? We'll have to wait and see exactly who's going to be appointed, but it seems likely he might stay on, and we'll have to see how many of the current figures are kept on as well. It seems like President Putin wants this to feel like a fresh start, sweeping the table, starting again. But in practice, probably a lot of his inner circle will still be in very key roles.
In order to get a better understanding of the state of play here, Lucy, please could you break down the political system in Russia for those of us who don't understand how it quite works? How is the prime minister elected? Is it by parliament or the presidency currently?
Yes, and that's one of the things that's changing. Currently, the president chooses his pick of prime minister and parliament votes to confirm it. That's the process we're expecting to happen today. The president has chosen his new prime minister and the parliament will just confirm it. And in reality, he has a very good grip on that parliament, so it's very likely that they will just wave that through. He's suggesting a move so that parliament would choose the prime minister, taking that away from the president. So that's one of the things that's likely to be changing. Russia at the moment has a two-parliament system, two-chamber parliament. There's also this thing called the State Council, which is being discussed. It's currently an advisory body made up of senior figures in government and in the authorities. And one of the changes that's being suggested is to give that State Council more powers as well and bring it more formally into the system. So it's all quite complicated. You need quite a good grip of understanding of the Russian political system. But in effect, this is a big change, sweeping, turning over the table and starting again. And it seems like it might fit into a master plan designed by President Vladimir Putin.
Well, let's talk a bit about that. So no doubt a massive shake-up in the government. Talk to us about the power structure now as it stands. Is Vladimir Putin still very much in the driver's seat in terms of the Russian state?
Absolutely. He's the man in charge. He has been now for 20 years in the various roles, president and prime minister. Very much the man with a lot of the power. There has been a lot of discussion, though, about what would happen when he has to step down from that role in 2024, and this might be the beginning of the answer to that. He is still pretty popular here in Russia. He has good poll ratings, but they are lower than they have historically been. For the last year, he's been grappling with a decline in his popularity ratings. There were also protests on the streets last summer against the state of the country as Russians see it. There's slow economic growth, there are high poverty rates. So there are issues here, and that is probably something that he wants to contend with. He actually referred to that directly in the address that he gave yesterday, saying that he knows there's a feeling for change. He wants to direct dialogue with the public about what to do that. He said he was bringing his federal address that he gave yesterday forward in order to have the chance to have more time to get on with key national projects, which he wants to make life better. And he mentioned some quite specific things like the birth rate here is declining, and he wants to give more support for families, for schools, healthcare, this kind of thing. So he is mindful that he needs to keep the Russian public on side, but at the moment it's not a disaster for him. He's not about to disappear, but he probably just mindful that he needs to keep people on side. But yeah, in the practice of day-to-day politics, he's very much has his grip on what happens, and it seems like probably he wants that to continue.
Speaking about the Russian public, Lucy, what are they saying about the latest developments there?
Well, as you'd expect, it's quite soon to have any kind of formal poll about this. All this only happened last night, but generally, President Putin does have fairly good popularity. He's seen as bringing stability to Russia, which is what most people here want after some of the chaos that came in the leadership before him. Of course, there are many people here who don't remember a time before President Putin was the leader, and that can be good and bad depending on the individuals. So people generally support Putin. It's likely that they will generally support his plans. But on the other hand, there are some quite fierce critics of him. As I said, there has been some growing discontent, and there are those who fear President Putin as a leader for life, and this will only seek to make them feel more fearful, because it seems as though he is lining things up to stay on longer than initially thought. So those people will not be happy about these plans. But in general, of course, as you'd expect, it's going to be a fairly mixed reaction, and we'll have to see how it all plays out before we have a really good formal official grip of the feeling in the country.
Yeah, no doubt. Interesting developments indeed. Lucy, thank you very much indeed for your reporting. Lucy's coming to us live from Moscow. Let's get your news.